my girlfriend cried. "We've been robbed. All your valuable inheritance is gone." But she didn't realize the hidden camera was recording. I gave the footage of her and her lover staging the robbery directly to the police. The look on her face when they came to arrest her for insurance fraud. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the kind of person to install hidden cameras in my own home. Trust had always been my default setting, maybe to a fault. But something had been gnawing at me for months, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it away. My girlfriend had moved in 8 months ago, right after my father passed away. The timing seemed compassionate at first. She wanted to be there for me during the worst period of my life. Dad had left me his entire estate, modest by some standards, but substantial enough. The house, some valuable collectibles, jewelry that belonged to my mother, and a few pieces of art he'd accumulated over the years. The insurance policy I'd taken out covered everything at roughly $200,000. She'd been unusually interested in the inventory process. I remembered her asking detailed questions about what I'd inherited, where I kept things, what the insurance covered. At the time, I'd attributed it to natural curiosity, or maybe even her way of trying to connect with my grief. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern forming. The small inconsistencies started about 3 months in. I'd notice items shifted slightly from where I'd placed them. Nothing dramatic, just enough to register as odd. A drawer left partially open when I knew I'd closed it. The attic access panel not quite flush with the ceiling. She developed this habit of suggesting I work late or take weekend trips to visit my sister across the state. Each time I returned, something felt different about the house, though I could never pinpoint exactly what. Then came the financial questions. She'd started asking about my insurance coverage with increasing frequency, framing it as concern for our future together. What would happen if something was stolen? How quickly would the claim process? Did I have documentation for everything? I'd answered honestly, never imagining where those conversations might lead. The decision to install cameras came after I found her in my office at 2 in the morning. She'd claimed she couldn't sleep and was just looking for something to read, but my father's inventory documents had been pulled from the file cabinet, spread across the desk. She'd laughed it off, said she was curious about family history. But her hands had been shaking when she'd gathered the papers back up. I'd installed 3 cameras the following week while she was at work. Small, motion-activated, hidden in ordinary objects. One in the living room where most of the valuable items were displayed, one in the bedroom, and one covering the front entrance. The setup had cost me $500 and a significant portion of my remaining faith in human nature. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual appeared in the footage. Normal domestic life played out in grainy digital format. I'd started to feel guilty about the surveillance, questioning my own paranoia. Maybe I was just projecting my grief and stress onto an innocent person. Maybe the trauma of losing my father had damaged my ability to trust. Then she told me she'd invited a friend to stay for a few days. Some guy she'd known from college who was passing through town. I'd never heard her mention him before, but she'd been insistent that he was just an old friend going through a rough patch. Against my better judgment, I'd agreed. He'd arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a single backpack and wearing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I'd made a point of working from home that Friday, something I rarely did. The dynamic between them was wrong from the start. Too familiar. Too comfortable. They'd speak in half-sentences and inside jokes, constantly touching each other's arms during conversation. When I'd walked into the kitchen unexpectedly, they'd been standing close enough to kiss, jumping apart when they'd heard my footsteps. That weekend, I told them I needed to drive upstate for a work emergency. Completely fabricated, but delivered with enough conviction to sell the story. I'd packed a bag, said I'd be back Sunday evening, and drove exactly 3 blocks before parking on a side street. Then I'd walked back through the neighbors' yards and let myself in through the basement entrance, settling into the small workshop area where I could monitor the camera feeds on my laptop in real time. They'd waited less than an hour after my supposed departure. I'd watched them through the screen as they'd pulled out detailed notes, my own inventory lists, which she must have photographed weeks ago. They'd worked methodically, wrapping items in towels and placing them in boxes they'd apparently hidden in the garage beforehand. My mother's jewelry, my father's coin collection, the small paintings from his study. They'd even taken the antique clock from the mantel, the one that had been in our family for 3 generations. But they hadn't stolen anything. Instead, They'd carefully packed everything into containers and moved it all to the attic, hiding the boxes behind old furniture and Christmas decorations. Then they'd staged the scene. Broken window glass scattered on the floor, courtesy of a pane they'd carefully removed and shattered outside. Drawers pulled open and overturned. Cushions slashed with a knife. They'd even thought to disable the alarm system, though they'd done it from the inside, which any investigator would immediately flag as suspicious. The performance had been almost impressive in its thoroughness. They'd spent 3 hours creating the perfect scene of a robbery, never once considering that they might be recorded. When they'd finished, they'd ordered takeout and spent the evening watching television, his arm around her shoulders, occasionally laughing about something on their phones. I'd stayed in that basement for hours, watching the footage replay, making sure I had everything documented from multiple angles. The rage had been overwhelming at first, then it had crystallized into something colder and more focused. She hadn't just betrayed my trust. She tried to profit from my father's death, to steal from his memory. Sunday evening, I'd returned as planned, pulling into the driveway with my overnight bag. I'd taken a breath, prepared myself for the performance I knew was coming, and walked through the front door. Her scream had been theatrical. Oscar-worthy, really. She'd come running from the bedroom, tears already streaming down her face, grabbing my arms and pulling me toward the living room. The place had been trashed, she'd sobbed. Someone had broken in. Everything was gone. All my father's things, my mother's jewelry, everything. She'd called out to her friend, who'd emerged from the kitchen with a perfectly calibrated expression of shock and concern. They'd discovered it just an hour ago, she'd explained, her voice breaking. They'd been out getting groceries and came back to find the window broken. She'd been too scared to go inside at first. Her friend had checked the house to make sure no one was still there. They'd been about to call the police when I'd arrived. I'd played along, letting the appropriate amount of shock and anger show on my face. I'd examined the broken window, the disturbed rooms, asking questions about what was missing. She'd provided a detailed list, remarkably accurate since she'd been working from my own documents. Everything of significant value, conveniently adding up to just under the insurance coverage limit. Her friend had suggested we call the police immediately. I'd agreed, pulling out my phone with trembling hands, though the tremor was from contained fury rather than distress. But first, I told them I needed to check something. I'd walked to my office, closed the door, and called a lawyer instead. The attorney had been a family friend, someone my father had trusted. I'd explained the situation in brief, clinical terms, and asked what I should do. His advice had been immediate. Document everything. Don't confront them, and contact both the police and the insurance company with the evidence. Let the system handle it. When I'd emerged from the office, I told them I'd called the police and they were sending someone over. This part was true. I had called them, and I had explained that I had video evidence of a staged robbery and insurance fraud in progress. I'd sent them the footage while I'd been in the office, watching the files upload with grim satisfaction. The investigating officers had arrived within 30 minutes. 2 detectives, both wearing expressions of professional neutrality. They'd examined the scene, taken statements from all 3 of us, and asked detailed questions about the missing items. She'd been confident throughout, her performance never wavering. Her friend had backed up every detail of her story. Then one of the detectives had asked if we had any security cameras. I'd hesitated for just a moment, drawing out the tension, before admitting that yes, I'd recently installed a few. Hidden cameras, I'd explained, because I'd been worried about break-ins after my father's death had been mentioned in the local obituaries. Would the footage be helpful? The change in her expression had been subtle but unmistakable. A flicker of panic, quickly suppressed. Her friend had gone very still beside her. The detective had asked to see the footage immediately. We'd all crowded into my office, watching as I'd pulled up the files on my computer. I'd started with Thursday's footage, showing her friend's arrival. Then Friday, the hours after my supposed departure. The detectives had watched in silence as the entire scheme unfolded on screen. The methodical packing, the hiding of items in the attic, the careful staging of the break-in. She tried to speak several times, but one of the detectives had held up a hand, asking her to wait until they'd finished viewing the evidence. When the footage ended, the silence in that office had been absolute. The detective had turned to her and asked if she wanted to explain what they'd just witnessed. She'd started crying again, but these tears were different, panicked, desperate. She'd tried several approaches. It was a misunderstanding. They'd been moving things for safekeeping. They'd planned to tell me. The window had been broken by accident. Each explanation had contradicted the last, her story falling apart in real time. Her friend had been smarter, or maybe just more experienced. He'd said nothing, just stared at the floor with his jaw clenched tight. The detective had asked me about the insurance policy. I'd confirmed that yes, there was coverage, and yes, we'd been about to file a claim for the stolen items. The detective had nodded slowly, making notes. Then she'd asked where the items actually were. I'd told them. Attic, northeast corner, behind the old furniture, exactly where they'd been hidden in the footage. They'd found everything within minutes, still carefully packed in the boxes, not a single item actually missing. The evidence was incontrovertible. Attempted insurance fraud, filing a false police report, conspiracy to commit fraud. The detective had read them their rights there in my living room, the same room where they'd staged the robbery just 2 days earlier. The look on her face when the handcuffs had closed around her wrists had been beyond description. Shock, disbelief, rage, fear, all cycling through her expression in rapid succession. She'd turned to me, and I'd seen the moment she'd realized I'd known all along, that I'd let her complete the entire scheme, given her every opportunity to stop, and she'd never wavered from her plan to rob me. She'd screamed then, not the theatrical performance from earlier, but something raw and genuine. She'd called me every name imaginable, insisted I'd set her up, that this was entrapment. Her friend had told her to shut up, advice she'd ignored, continuing her tirade all the way to the police car. The next few days had been a blur of statements and paperwork. The prosecutor had been almost gleeful about the case. Video evidence, clear intent, significant dollar amount. Open and shut, she'd said. They'd both been charged with conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, filing a false report, and attempted theft by deception. I'd learned more about her friend during the investigation. He had a record, 2 prior fraud convictions, 1 for identity theft. She'd apparently connected with him months ago, deliberately, seeking someone with experience in this kind of scheme. Their social media messages had told the whole story once the police had obtained warrants. They'd been planning this since before she'd even moved in with me. That detail had hurt worse than the betrayal itself. Everything had been calculated from the start. The relationship, the concern during my grief, the interest in my inheritance, all of it had been in service of this plan. I'd been a mark, nothing more. The trial had been anticlimactic. With video evidence and their own messages, plea deals had been inevitable. She'd gotten 3 years, her friend 5 because of his priors. Restitution, probation, the works. I'd never spoken to her again after that night in my living room. Months later, sitting in my father's study surrounded by the items they'd tried to steal, I'd thought about the hidden cameras. They were still there, still recording, though I'd probably never need them again. Some people had called my decision to install them paranoid. Others had praised my foresight. I'd seen it as neither. Trust was a gift I'd given freely once. She'd taken that gift and weaponized it against me, turning my grief into an opportunity and my love into leverage. The cameras hadn't been about paranoia. They'd been about protecting what my father had left behind, the physical manifestations of his life's work and my mother's memory. I'd thought about what my father might have said about the whole situation. He'd been a practical man, not given to sentimentality, but fierce in protecting family. I'd imagined he'd approve of the cameras, of the methodical documentation, of letting them hang themselves with their own rope. He'd taught me to be trusting, but not foolish, kind, but not stupid. The house felt different now, emptier in some ways, despite all the items being exactly where they'd always been. But cleaner too, like something toxic had been removed and the space could breathe again. I'd started dating again, cautiously, with boundaries in place that I'd never thought I'd need. The cameras stayed up, visible now, no longer hidden. A deterrent and a reminder. If you like this story, please like this video and subscribe us for more such real-life-based stories. Thanks in advance.